Hi everyone, it's Janice here, and for a couple of years now I've been meaning to re-record kind of part 2, but actually part 1 of the story, like sort of like the Star Wars thing. If any of you saw my first video of just the story of how my husband and I, how we met and how God brought a verse into our life and continued to bring that verse over the next, well, it's going to be 20 years this August. In that first video, I talk about how I never knew how I knew that verse. Well, a couple years ago, I found out the answer. I found out how I knew that verse, and it totally blew me away. I just couldn't believe it. So I wanted to share this with you. And so a few years ago, my oldest son was in like grade 8 or grade 9, and he asked me if I had any baby pictures of him, which I thought was funny because he's my firstborn, and we took, of course, a million baby photos, but that was actually in the days before digital cameras, so they were all in albums, shoved under the stairs. So I went and pulled up one of the albums, or a couple of them, got him the picture he needed for his biology class, and I found this card. And I couldn't believe it because it says Janice, and it's spelled my way, and you can almost never find a card that has my spelling on it. But it says Janice, Hebrew origin, God's grace. And then it has this verse, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Psalm 37:4. And that is my verse. That's the verse that popped into my head the weekend, or a few days after I first met my husband at a camp. And I didn't know where I knew that verse from, but it's because on my 20th birthday in 1994, my friend Mary Janelle gave me this card. And she just wrote, Janice, you are a precious gift from God, love, Mary Janelle and Steve. So she gave me this card because she happened to be in a Christian bookstore. She happened to see my spelling and a nice little verse, and she bought it for me. And for years I had it on my fridge. And then I took it off my fridge and I totally forgot all about it. And somehow it was shoved in a photo album with baby pictures. So I must have come across it at some point, but it never, the significance didn't come to me until Caleb asked for it, until I found it a couple years ago. And the reason this is so amazing to me is, well, a few things. It has my spelling. There's nothing with my spelling. And it just so happened that my friend went into a store, found a card with my spelling, and it just happened to have this verse on it. And so I learned the verse without even really working at it. To be honest, I never would have actually chosen this verse as any kind of a life verse or anything, because it's a little too hallmarky for me. I totally believe it. I believe, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. But I believe that when we delight ourselves in him, the desires of our heart change so that our desires line up with God's desires. And those desires turn out to be better than any selfish desires we could have. So it is amazing to me that I have a verse like this. But the other thing that's really amazing to me is that I had this card on my fridge back in like 1995 or something, 96, a couple years before I met my husband. And one day I was in church and an old neighbor showed up in my church, and he was one of these people that I didn't expect to show up in church. And I was really glad to see him. I always love when someone starts exploring what church is all about, and I always hope that when they explore church, that'll be a time when God is presented really for who he is. Because once you know who God really is and how much he loves you, you'll never be the same. You'll never go back to how you used to be after you've had a really true encounter with God and experience his love for you. It's just amazing. So I was really thrilled that this guy showed up in church. And then a bunch of us in college and careers got together afterwards and we went out for lunch. And so he came to my condo and he saw this card on my fridge. And I remember I had forgotten this story, but I remember he said, wow, that's so amazing that your parents named you Janice and it means God's grace and it has to do with this verse. Like, that's great that your parents like chose a name that means so much. And at the time I said, oh no, no, you don't understand. That's just a nice card. It doesn't actually mean anything. My parents didn't choose my name because it meant God's grace. Like, a whole bunch of names go back to God's grace. And I, at the time, explained that it really didn't have any significance. But now, looking back, which is so often the way, looking back and seeing how much God has brought this verse into our marriage at specific times, I know that God totally chose this verse and has used it considerably over the last, well, it'll be 20 years in August, 21 years since I met him. So I just think it is so cool that though my parents may not have named me Janice and connected it with this verse, I completely believe that some printer at some point wrote my name, matched it up with this verse, and it was absolutely no accident. It was no accident that they matched my name up with my spelling with this verse, and it was no accident that my friend Mary Janelle found it and gave it to me. And it was certainly no accident that that it popped into my head when I met my husband, and it was no accident that when I went home from that camp, already knowing and believing that he was the one I was going to marry, and he was God's, the desire of my heart. It was no accident that a couple days later when I started to doubt it, I went into my bathroom, turned over this little flip calendar, and there's the verse. Just right then, and I remember, if you remember, I repented and went down to my mailbox and there was a letter from my husband, and that's when it all really started. It was no accident that years later, on our anniversary, the pastor used that verse. It was no accident that in a Bible study, a lady prayed that for me, not even knowing who I was, but just it just encouraged me at that time. And then it was also no accident when I decided to share that story with a group of girls on a weekend retreat, and my friend started laughing because she had chosen a card for me before the weekend retreat even began, and she gave me this card and it had that very same verse. So it just is, it totally blows me away. And then today when I went to find this little calendar, I found it and I went back to July 5th, and it has a little note on it, and it says N&J met 1998. You know what it says here? This isn't a verse, it's just a little little saying. And it says, God is the beginning, not just the starting point, but the source of all things. Wow, that's kind of cool. So I just wanted to record this follow-up video of where I knew how I had learned that verse, but I also wanted to say to my old neighbor that I told you that that verse wasn't, that card didn't mean anything, but actually it blows me away how much it means. So thanks for watching, and that's about it.